It'd be helpful if I unmuted. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, the rise of entrepreneurship during the pandemic. My name is Brandon Hofstad, and I am the Community Economic Development Program Manager with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension, and it's my pleasure to kick off this webinar. Today's webinar is a discussion of entrepreneurial activity in Wisconsin during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we know that entrepreneurship is a key and an important part of a healthy economy. However, ensuring that new business activity leads to significant economic impact by creating high quality jobs, we also know that can be very difficult. So today, our presenter, Dr. Tessa Conroy, will share data on entrepreneurial activity in the state, and we'll discuss what communities can do in conversation to help take a lead role in helping entrepreneurs grow and be successful. Before we begin and before I turn it over to Dr. Conroy, I would like to offer or say thank you to the U.S. Economic Development Administration. Today's webinar was made possible in part by a grant from the U.S. EDA in support of the EDA University Center at the University of Wisconsin. And then finally, a couple of housekeeping. This will be recorded, and we will be placing the final video on our website. We will share that with all folks that are joining today and who have registered, and we'll send out any supporting documents as well to be included. And again, you can look at our website and there will be a follow-up email. If you need closed captioning, there is a closed captioning option at the bottom, so feel free to check that on. And as a friendly reminder, if you are not speaking, please be sure to mute your microphone. We will have an opportunity for question and answer after Dr. Conroy does her presentation. And if you're not comfortable asking a question by unmuting, you can also feel free to do so by dropping it into the chat. You can either do it publicly or you can send it to myself private. Again, I should show up at the top of your participant list. My name is Brandon. And now I would like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Tessa Conroy. Dr. Conroy is an economic development specialist and associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She works in the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics, and as well as the Department of Extension. Dr. Conroy studies community economic growth and development and small business dynamics and entrepreneurship. And with that, she will be talking about entrepreneurship during the pandemic. So Tessa, the floor is yours.
All right. Can you hear me? Thumbs up? Yes, I got a thumbs up. Great. And you can see my screen, it looks like, so we're good to go. Thanks so much, Brandon, for the introduction, and welcome everybody to the webinar. I like to tell people that the pandemic and the coinciding economic downturn, this was my first recession. And what I mean by that is my first one thinking about in a professional capacity. Of course, I was around for the Great Recession, 2009, but not quite looking at it with the same lens that I am now. And we just had a really interesting trajectory in terms of entrepreneurship during the pandemic, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. So I welcome conversation and discussion. So please use the chat or interrupt me. I don't mind. But Brandon or Chris might have to help me keep an eye out just because it's easy for me to keep talking and I don't see the chat very well. So again, just feel free to interject. So here we are, the rise of entrepreneurship during the pandemic. So a couple key points, if you remember nothing else from the presentation, I hope you remember that in Wisconsin, business application reached the highest level on record during the pandemic. So that is what I'm hanging my hat on when I say we had a real rise or increase of entrepreneurial activity during the pandemic. To be more specific, business applications increased by 21% from 2018 to 2020. So 2020 being the first year of the pandemic, but it wasn't the whole year, kind of starting in March. And then increased again from 2020 to 2021 by 23%. So it wasn't seemingly a temporary increase, that this has continued in the months as the pandemic has continued. And one thing that I want to talk about a little bit today is that this is, in my mind, as an economic development person, exciting to see this budding entrepreneurial activity. But it's important to note that when we're thinking about business applications, these are really just an early indicator of entrepreneurial activity. And very few of those businesses are actually going to come to fruition, that are actually going to become businesses with paid employees. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end and how we might think about enhancing or growing that share that do go on to become fully operational. So I want to start here. Some of you might have seen this slide or one like it. So this is from the current population survey, the number of people who say that they are self-employed. And we looked at February 2020, so what we might consider the last normal month before the pandemic. And then we benchmark each month of the pandemic against February 2020. So what you see in April is these really large declines across racial and ethnic groups. So more than 40% decline in people saying they were self-employed among the Black and African American population. Similarly large declines among Latinx, Asian, foreign, and then smaller for white, but still a substantial decline, getting close to 20%. So early on in the pandemic, when we were talking about what's going to happen to entrepreneurship and the world was to some extent in a standstill, it really wasn't looking great, to be honest. It looked like entrepreneurship might stall or decline rapidly. And so when we saw it start to come back, that made for a really interesting sort of U-turn in entrepreneurial activity. So you can see among the Black and African American population, by the end of the summer, July, August, we started to see the number of self-employed come back to where it was pre-pandemic and even grow from there. Similarly for the white population, Latinx, some more persistent declines among Asian and foreign born. But on the whole, we really started to see entrepreneurial activity come back by the end of the first summer of 2020. This is all national data though. And so we want to think about what's happening in Wisconsin, of course. And so we're going to switch data sources. This particular metric that I'm using here isn't available. So that's what led me to look at business applications. So what is a business application? These data are handy because they're available at the state and county level. So we can look at what's going on locally. And what it is an application for an employer identification number. Businesses are going to apply to the IRS for an EIN. And we might think of this like a social security number for businesses. And the main reason people or business owners are going to need it is to file their payroll taxes. So when they hire their first employees, this number is going to be essential. But it might even be important for other business functions like opening a business bank account. So an EIN is useful to businesses that plan to have employees, as well as potentially those that don't. So employer and non-employer businesses alike. So we can use these business applications to kind of look at intentions to start a business. But as I said, these are about the intention to start a business, and not all EIN applications are going to lead to a fully formed operational businesses with paid employees. This is just an early indicator of some entrepreneurial activity. So when we look at business applications here, that's what I'm showing you for Wisconsin. This data set goes back to 2004, so that's the earliest they started keeping track. We have monthly business applications for the state here. So starting at about 3,000 applications per month back in July of 2004. And then we can look through the monthly applications through all of 2021. That actually goes through December of 2021. It's just not labeled. And so what you see is a really dramatic change. Early on in the early 2000s, we might expect to see around 3,000 business applications per month. That started to pick up a little bit in around 2014. We start to see a little bit of an upward trend in business applications, getting close to maybe 4,000 applications per month. And then you see right there in early 2020, a noticeable decline, I would say. So maybe that's similar to the previous slide when we were seeing this big decline in self-employment. Similarly here, we're seeing a drop in business applications. But then you see this huge rebound. We had the largest number of applications on record for Wisconsin in July of 2020 at close to 7,000. And that was a high point, but even since then, business applications have remained elevated. And even at the data that I've looked at that's available so far for this year, for 2022, it seems that these are persistent increases in entrepreneurial intention. So high and staying relatively high. So in the previous slide, we were looking at monthly business applications. This might be a little bit easier to digest. This is the annualized figures for business applications. So kind of same thing, just a different lens on it. And you see that going back here now to kind of Great Recession era, looking at where we were ending 2021, you can see this sort of, we had between 30 and 40,000 business applications, relatively stable through 2014. Then you see it start to pick up. So, maybe this is the story of economic recovery kind of catching up. This was a period of economic expansion. So we saw increases in entrepreneurial activity. But then in 2020 and 2021, you see this real acceleration in business applications. So a continuation and an acceleration of an existing trend in terms of picking up entrepreneurial activity. So this is showing the percentage increase. So in red, I'm showing the percentage increase rather than the level increase. So percentage increase from 2018 to 2020, and then in black from 2020 to 2021. So this is the sort of opening stat I shared with you, 21% increase in 2020, and then a 23% increase in 2021. In Wisconsin, you see, we have this fairly even increase year over year, and that's just something that I find sort of observationally interesting and different than other states. So Indiana is maybe most comparable to Wisconsin in terms of trends, just over 25% increases in both years. But then you see different patterns in other states. So in Illinois, in Michigan, they really had this surge of activity in 2020. And then it quiets down. There's still an increase in 2021, but the most substantial is definitely in that first year of the pandemic. And I think that's something that we were talking about in economic development circles. Like, are these changes temporary, or might we expect these changes to persist past the current circumstances? And it seems like maybe there's a different answer depending on where you are. This could have to do with, I think we're still trying to answer these questions about why the differences are. I could speculate that these are differences in state level pandemic policies, perhaps, that different policy conditions created different incentives and motivations for pursuing entrepreneurship. That might most simply be differences in the unemployment rate. Oftentimes, when we're talking about entrepreneurship, one of the motivating factors we discuss is just a lack of other employment opportunities. And so in the pandemic, when we had really high unemployment, particularly in some sectors and in some regions, that's been one of the factors that we discuss as really driving entrepreneurship. But I think this is more than that. I think this is more than a sort of necessity entrepreneurship story. We also saw new opportunities. So I'll talk a little bit more about this in the following slides, but with the pandemic, I don't want to minimize the hardship and the devastation, but there were some economic opportunities that came with it, particularly in terms of how consumer behavior changed, how supply chain logistics, how what we buy and where we buy it changed, and that seemed to create some opportunities. And then we also heard a lot of anecdotes from people about how the pandemic motivated them to sort of pursue that venture. Why am I doing this job that I hate? I would rather be the captain of my own ship. I would rather be my own boss and start to think more seriously about entrepreneurship. So for all of these, different reasons, there's this sort of like industrial policy question. Are the industries and the policies at the state level responsible for some of this variation in terms of economics, but then just in general, how people were thinking about opportunity and their motivation to become a business owner, I think also might explain the persistent rise, but also the variation.
Tessa,
Mhm.
there is a question, and again, maybe you'll address this a little bit later, but any data on Wisconsin business applications, urban versus rural, and broadband, underserved versus served?
Yeah, so stay tuned. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And if I don't cover it satisfactorily, we'll talk about it more at the end and we'll revisit that question. So thank you. So just to kind of summarize these base level trends. So in 2019, to put hard numbers to it, we had close to 44,000 business applications. And then by the end of 2021 for the year, we had just over 65,000. So you see this, again, substantial increase. As I mentioned, 21% increase in that first year, 23% increase on top of that. So a 48% increase over 2 years. So for me, when I look at a lot of economic indicators, I expect to see change over time, but generally the year over year change is quite small. Seeing a 48% increase in any measure of entrepreneurial activity is pretty wild. So this has just been so interesting to me, and the business application data has just been a great source of insight for us. So again, I just want to highlight a little bit about diversity here. This is the slide I already showed you. I just want to remind ourselves of the Black and African American trends in self-employment here on the far left of the screen. Really large increases early on, and then it rebounded. So this is all benchmarked against February 2020. So compared to February of 2020, we had a 40% increase, or excuse me, decrease in the first full month of the pandemic, April. And then about a 25, we were still down about 25% in May, and then recovering by July and August. And this is consistent actually with some other research that we've seen. So in Black communities, small business surged during the pandemic. So as I just mentioned, Black business owners declined by about 41% from February to April, compared to 22% overall. But then following this initial decline, entrepreneurial activity more than recovered. And when we get into some research about this, we do in fact see that areas with a larger share of Black and African American residents had higher rates of business formation. And this is just a brand new paper that was really interesting. This relationship is especially true or especially strong in high income Black neighborhoods. And one of the findings of this paper is that the increases in entrepreneurial activity followed federal spending packages, like the CARES Act. So this suggests a story about access to capital and capital constraints for entrepreneurs. So once we had influxes of cash or capital into households via, various stimulus payments, that seems to relax a really key constraint on entrepreneurial activity. And sure enough, we see that this corresponds with increases in entrepreneurial activity. So I think one of the policy lessons here is around the access to capital or financing constraints that perhaps keeps entrepreneurial activity artificially low. And with adequate financing, what might we expect to see entrepreneurial activity kind of reach new heights? And that was at least true in this case. And again, the ongoing conversation here, and that's even discussed in this article, is this a story about necessity entrepreneurship? So perhaps people facing unemployment or very few job opportunities. And I think in the context of the pandemic as well, really thinking about, even if your job still existed, did you feel safe going to work? And so if not, if you're facing unemployment or don't feel safe going in, perhaps one of the more viable paths for you is creating a job. But even still, I think that this can be a story about wealth creation, that for entrepreneurs who are creating their own opportunity, sometimes it's hard to say at the outset, just because an entrepreneur maybe started for necessity-based reasons, that won't go on to be a high growth business. I think we're a little bit quick to judge necessity-driven entrepreneurship. And I think even still, all of the opportunities that the pandemic created, again, not to minimize the hardship, also points to a story about wealth creation and income for entrepreneurs. One of the reasons I say that is because of this graphic. So I have to rearrange my screen here just 1 second. So this is the growth in annual total business applications by major sector for the US. So if the trends in Wisconsin were to follow the national trends, we would expect that transportation and warehousing and retail trade were sort of the top two sectors in which a lot of this new entrepreneurial activity happened. And so for transportation and warehousing, this has largely been attributed to, again, the changing way in which we bought things and perhaps have them delivered to us. So this required new opportunities for storage and transportation and logistics. And so a lot of those businesses would show up in transportation and warehousing. So again, the way we maybe shopped more online, the way we had things delivered to our homes more often, a lot of those corresponding business opportunities might show up in that very top horizontal bar. And then retail trade. Retail trade is something that's interesting to me as well too. So most of the growth in the retail trade sector was in what we call non-store retailers. So that's just another way pretty much of saying online retail. So a lot of people taking sort of an online shop route in terms of their entrepreneurial venture. So it's been sort of speculated how big are these businesses, and maybe we don't know. One of the things that's interesting to me about seeing growth in the non-store retailers is that tends to be a women-dominated sector. And we also know that women are more likely to run home-based businesses. And so that makes broadband internet really important. And I think also another connection that I want to make here is during the pandemic, we saw women leaving the labor force at pretty dramatic rates. And there's evidence to suggest that women are using entrepreneurship in some circumstances to sort of balance the need or desire to earn an income with the need and desire to be a primary childcare provider. And during the pandemic, as childcare went away, it seems to be the case that women most acutely, not that men don't also experience this, but women most acutely were in a position of having to provide childcare. Well, if I have to provide childcare, maybe I can't go to work like I used to, or even work from home in the same capacity that I used to. But entrepreneurship, having my own business, is a path that maybe lets me juggle those two in a way that I can manage. So I'm really curious about that sector in particular, but I just want to highlight again that the various changes that we as consumers showed during the pandemic, this is sort of the flip side of that, what that meant for entrepreneurs, identifying opportunities. I think I'm good on time, so I just wanted to share, there was an anecdote in the news about some musicians in New York who were no longer able to play concerts. And so in order to earn a living during the pandemic, so you could say that this is necessity driven, but it went on to be quite successful. During the pandemic, they got together and basically created like a jingle writing business. So for all of those birthdays and weddings that we weren't able to celebrate together, you could send a friend or family member a custom jingle, and this went on to be quite successful for them. So all kinds of new opportunities that showed up during the pandemic in some ways. And I think you see that here across the board, even agriculture down at the bottom. Something that we've been talking a lot about in my household is the rise of agritourism. So I would still like to go do something. I would prefer it be outside because I feel safer. And so we saw this increase in demand for agritourism or farm tourism. And I suspect that that's part of the increase that we saw in agricultural based opportunities, perhaps down in the bottom sector or linked to that sector. So another kind of aspect of these trends that I want to highlight is just that it was really unique. Most of the time when we're talking about a recession, we wouldn't expect for entrepreneurial activity to increase, that Excuse me one second, I just want to get organized. We wouldn't expect entrepreneurial activity to increase. Most recessions are characterized by financially constrained consumers. We know in 2008, homeowners faced unfavorable terms on their mortgages, unemployment increased, savings balances fell. And so for these reasons, we wouldn't have expected entrepreneurship to increase. And a lot of those reasons we might have seen in recessions past as well. This was really quite unique, and not that, again, it wasn't devastating for some households, but we saw, increases in wealth via the housing market. We saw some savings balances accounts increase. Actually, people maybe weren't spending as much in the same categories that they were before. And so it was just a very different economic downturn. And you see that here even with regard to business applications. So in black, I'm showing you business applications from January to December in 2008. And then I'm showing you business applications for 2020 from January to December. And in Wisconsin, during the Great Recession, so the black line, entrepreneurial activity was fairly flat. There's maybe a modest decline there. That's actually probably a pretty good outcome. In a lot of states, entrepreneurial activity actually declined. And then when you compare that to the pandemic, that's where you see this big spike and this big increase. And I think it just points to these very different circumstances that people still, in many cases, had money to spend. I know that's not true in all cases, but with the stimulus payments, that created different circumstances. We didn't have the same financial crisis alongside the economic downturn. And so entrepreneurs seem to be better positioned to take advantage of some of those opportunities. So here we can look at the county level, and credit to Matt Cures for his wonderful GIS skills and beautiful map here. So any county that you're seeing in the sort of light pink to red had a positive change from 2019 to 2020 in business applications per capita. And then the cold counties in blue had a decrease. So as much as this is a story about increasing entrepreneurial activity on the whole, it's certainly not true everywhere. We see quite a bit of spatial variation in the change in business applications. So some of the highest or largest percentage increases were in some, I would say, relatively rural areas. That can be what we call just a low base problem. So if there weren't very many applications to begin with, as just a quick example, let's say there were 10 business applications in 2019, well, going to 20 in 2020 is, doubling the amount of business applications. So in some of those rural counties, that's part of what's driving that large percentage increase. Sometimes is just we have low numbers to begin with, and then when we calculate a percentage increase, it looks large. But in some of the metro areas, even in Milwaukee County, for example, the large metro area, a substantial increase, and even in a metro county. So just interesting here to look at the variation on average across counties. We had about a 9% increase in business applications per capita, and a wide range from actually a 38% decrease in Rusk County to over 100% increase in Forest. And again, I think we're still trying to understand what would drive this variation. I would speculate that this has something to do with the industries there, the extent of unemployment, and certainly access to broadband. We know that broadband is connected to entrepreneurial outcomes. Places with better access have more entrepreneurship. And with the prevalence of online business activity over the last 2 years, I suspect that would be a key factor. So this map is the change from 2019 to 2020. This map shows where we landed in 2020. So what was the level or rate of business applications at the end of the year 2020? So again, quite a bit of spatial variation. Southeast Wisconsin having among the highest business applications per capita, but also parts of the Northeast. So a lot of entrepreneurial activity. And then some in the sort of the Fox Valley, getting close to maybe the Twin Cities out on the western side of the state as well. ranging from 3.9 applications per 1,000 people to 17.2 business applications. I like to look at the rate. I like to give the number of applications per 1,000 because it's a number that I feel like I can wrap my head around a little bit more if we were to think of a very small town or even a neighborhood of people. How many of them are going to earn a living by creating a business for themselves? And I think if you expect, around 7, 8, 9, 10 of them are considering an entrepreneurial venture, that number is something that I can make sense of a little bit more. So interesting trends here, certainly, maybe as expected in terms of where we see some additional population density, we see more entrepreneurial activity. And then sometimes in Wisconsin, we see those pockets of entrepreneurship also in the Northwest. So we kind of looked at things by industry. We sort of looked at things by county. I also want to talk a little bit about the different types of business applications. So far, we've just focused on the total business applications, but we can break those out by category as well. So what we're interested in is high propensity business applications. So as I mentioned to you, just because somebody applies for an employer identification number doesn't mean that that business is going to come to fruition, doesn't mean it's going to become operational. And so from an economic development perspective, we might want to know, well, how many of them are actually, likely to go on to hire employees? How many are actually likely to open their doors? And that's where the high propensity applications come in. So a small number of businesses are considered likely to actually become operational, and even smaller number actually do. Those are going to be the real business formations. And we can classify the high propensity, though, based on characteristics of the application. So we can say, okay, we have all of these applications coming in. Based on what we've observed in the past, we know businesses of this type tend to be most likely to go on to hire employees. So that could be have to do with their legal status in terms of how are they incorporated. This has to do with their industry, if they're a franchise, things like that. And that's what I'll show you here. So you've already seen total applications. That was one of the first slides I showed you with the gray line. Now we're looking at the red line, which is those high propensity business applications. So far fewer, a relatively small share of total applications are expected to go on to hire employees. Those are kind of our highly likely or high propensity category. So in terms of, maybe focusing economic development resources, thinking about this category might be where we would, expect a larger bang for our buck. I'm going to offer some caveats to that, though, before we're done today. And then the black line is maybe what we're most interested in. These are the real business formations. So of those businesses that applied for their EIN, how many after 2 years actually hired employees? So when I say a business formation, I'm talking about a business formation with paid employees. They could have also maybe go on to operate without paid employees, so a one-man or one-woman shop. But here I'm just focusing on those that do go on to hire employees. And what you see is that, based on, well, let me clarify. So we can know for sure, going back to about 2018, which of business applications actually form businesses. And then the census offers projected business formation. So based on historical trends, what might we expect to happen over the last 2 years of the applications that we had come in? And so if you compare the gray line to the black line, basically the increase in businesses with paid employees is much lower than what the applications might suggest. So certainly there's a small uptick in business formations, but compared to the increase in applications, it's really quite modest, I would argue. So let's talk a little bit more about those business formations.
Tessa, just real quickly, there is a question about, I believe you operationalized business formations with employees, and just, I guess maybe if you can talk about that a little bit in terms of why you chose that, because that may not have been the intent of some people. So they may just wanted to be a sole shop or something, a solopreneur.
Yeah.
So can you speak to that just for a moment?
Yes, I didn't choose it. The census chose it. If I had chosen it, I would have loved to know which of those businesses do go on to operate basically as one man and one woman shops. When we look at trends in entrepreneurial activity, most growth is of those types of businesses, people who don't have paid employees. So I think we miss a lot by focusing on just those that go on to have paid employees. But I think it's just a function of how this data is being collected. An EIN, the primary reason you would get one would be to file your payroll taxes, and you would only file payroll taxes when you have paid employees. And so I think just as a feature of, these are people who are saying they anticipate needing an EIN because they're going to have payroll, which of them actually do go on to have payroll? Those are the two characteristics that the census is paying attention to and using here. But certainly a second path would be to go on operating as a non-employer business. It's just not going to be kept track of here. And then, a third path would be that the business does not operate at all, not as a non-employer or a paid employer. But the non-employers are something I'd like to see more closely tracked, certainly. So coming back to those business formations, so which of those businesses go on to have paid employees, that number is going to be low compared to the number of applications. From 2009 to 2021, roughly 12% of business applications resulted in a business formation within 2 years. So the way they keep track does allow some time for that transition to happen. One thing that I think is interesting is that the rate of business formation has generally declined. So as an example, just before the Great Recession, January 2008, to give some specifics we had about a 14% formation rate. So just over 3,000 applications and 425 formations. But by January of 2020, we see closer to 3,500 applications and 375 projected business formations, so an 11% rate. And that's been true, going back from 2004 to 2022. I just kind of picked the Great Recession because it's a nice benchmark. But in general, we see the sort of slow decline in the number of businesses that are going on to hire employees. It's not surprising to me when I look at the change in the number of businesses in Wisconsin. The number of businesses with paid employees is pretty flat. And then we see this really, what I would consider dramatic growth in the number of businesses without paid employees. In fact, in rural Wisconsin, some of the only growth that we have in the business community is businesses without paid employees. So seeing this long-term trend isn't surprising to me. I think it partly reflects just restructuring in the economy. For example, maybe we expect to see fewer businesses that have all of their services in-house. So maybe we don't hire an accountant, a lawyer, a photographer, if we're maybe a news agency, these various services, we don't keep them in-house anymore. Instead, we keep our business small and then we contract out for those various business services. So it lends itself to more contract workers, gig workers, that sort of thing. So a smaller efficient scale for businesses. So I got ahead of myself, but all of this amounts to, in my mind, one of the takeaways is this is a story about there being more non-employers. So we have a higher level of applications. We all saw that big increase during the pandemic in business applications, but a lower rate of resulting business formations. So the result is that we still have an increase in business formation. So we should still expect to see growth in the number of businesses we have in Wisconsin, though it's going to be a smaller increase than the number of applications might suggest, just because that rate of conversion has been coming down over time. During the pandemic, the rise in business applications is more likely to result in non-employer firms than employer businesses. So again, there are several different data sources we might consider to look at these different types of businesses. And for me here, it is showing up yet again that when we look at business applications, the number that we expect to become paid employer businesses is going down, and the proportion that instead we expect to go on and operate as non-employers, one man, one woman shops, is really growing. And so I think that's something that we want to be paying attention to. Of course, overall, this rise of entrepreneurial activity is exciting. There are going to be more paid employer businesses based on the data we're seeing here. But perhaps even more so, we're going to see a lot more the one man, one woman shops, sole proprietors, and we want to have those on our radar as economic developers. So with that in mind, I'll just talk a little bit about some strategies that I think we might want to consider. I would love to hear what others are considering or thinking about or discussing in their communities. These are just a quick list that I came up with here. So one being investment in broadband infrastructure and adoption, as many of these new businesses do have an online component or are these non-store retailers. So that suggests online activity is really a key part of this story about the rise in entrepreneurship. I think we want to be thinking about what kind of trainings we can offer, especially for online marketing, retail platform, shipping, and logistics support. We know that that's been really difficult during the pandemic. Financing programs that reduce capital barriers for small businesses. So this is another area of research that is interesting to me, but anecdotally, we're just hearing that it's really difficult to get small loans. So, I'm maybe talking about loans that are under $100,000, and as you get smaller, it's even harder to get. So, for those very small businesses, that those small amounts might be most appropriate for their financing strategy, but can be difficult to access. So what do we have in our communities that is a viable pathway to access small amounts of loans, even, as well as large amounts, but small amounts being appropriate for those non-employers in many cases. Network development and peer-to-peer learning programs and opportunities for entrepreneurs to share their needs and access business services. I think that the pandemic perhaps, exacerbated to some extent isolationism, and I can see that being true, particularly among entrepreneurs. I think we like to think of entrepreneurs as going it alone, and certainly that is part of the experience, but even a sole proprietor is going to be needing to form partnerships, develop collaborations, make connections. Some of the most valuable learning that we see happen for entrepreneurs is from other entrepreneurs. So staying connected in the network, and then also just connecting with their local business service providers so that they're getting what they need. I have childcare on this list as well. Entrepreneurs need a lot of the same things all the other workers need, and then childcare being among them. So when we see childcare challenges, certainly we would expect that to affect entrepreneurs as well as the workforce or wage and salary workforce. And then programs tailored specifically to sole proprietors who have no employees, as many new entrepreneurs fall into this category. So some of the things that I mean by that are, what can we do to cater to home-based businesses and the challenges they face? Those could be visibility challenges, those could be market access challenges, those could be connectivity challenges. So thinking about those really small businesses and maybe what are their unique needs. With all of this in mind, these strategies are really about what can we do to increase that rate of business formation? So we have all of this intent to create business as measured by the applications. How do we help entrepreneurs realize that so they go on to fully form businesses? And I tried to think here about strategies of, strategies that would support businesses that want to have paid employees, but also strategies that are going to support entrepreneurs who maybe their goal is to operate as a one-man or one-woman shop, and how do we support those, again, I call them non-employers, but those businesses without paid employees. So we have time for discussion. I'm certainly looking forward to hearing what everybody has to say. So with that, I will, I'll stop there.
Great. Just real quickly, Melissa, our partner from the Institute for Business and Entrepreneurship, did drop in the sole proprietorship data for youreconomy.org. So please check that out. Again, we'll have that linked as part of a resource at the final webpage. And then Sam, Tessa, he asked a question about how does the data capture a business, perhaps an LLC, that for accounting purposes pays the owner as an employee of the business?
That should be in here, is my understanding. I can double check that. But if they have employees, that's a good question. I think it should be in here, but I can check. Thanks for the question, Sam.
And then Michael, what about benefits for the owners and employees? Do you have data on how many are going without healthcare, dental, et cetera, when leaving jobs to create their businesses?
I don't. That is, I think, oftentimes the elephant in the room when we're talking about entrepreneurship. Oftentimes we're seeing jobs created, whether that be for the entrepreneur, him or herself, or for their employees. And oftentimes there's a concern about job quality, that yes, a lot of new jobs come from entrepreneurial activity, but some of the jobs in these new and young businesses don't offer the same level or they aren't of the same quality as jobs in more mature firms. So I think that's certainly a valid question. Unfortunately, I don't have the data to answer it here.
What about having spouses or partners who still have the job with benefits? Is there any data on how many people are, like the farmer whose spouse is going off farm? That's an old metaphor, I know, but.
So that's I don't have the data here, but we do know there's research suggesting that that's really important, right? So even in some of my work, you can look at who transitions into self-employment, and oftentimes the people who transition into self-employment are people who have a partner through whom they can get their health care or health insurance. So that access to benefits and the job lock it can create, or the release in some instances that it can create for a partner are really important factors as well.
Great. And just to answer, yes, we will be posting presentation information following the webinar. Cliff asks, how about an outreach to second-year tech college students focused on entrepreneurship?
Sure. I mean, I don't know if there's more specific context that I can comment on, but I certainly, the way I approach entrepreneurship in economic development context is that, we wouldn't want someone to not become successful as an entrepreneur for lack of support. Entrepreneurship isn't for everybody, but for those people who could be successful, I wouldn't want them to encounter a barrier that would prevent the realization of their business. As we know that entrepreneurs, it's linked to job creation, poverty alleviation, income growth. So wherever we can look for those pockets of untapped entrepreneurial activity, I think those efforts make sense.
And this could be to you, Tessa, but as I'm looking at the list, and I won't call anybody out who's in the audience, but we have quite a few experts on the line, both from Minnesota and also the state, our own state. Bill asks, are there any best examples of entrepreneurship support centers in communities?
So, I mean, there are lots of good examples. Something that I've been paying attention to more, any centers that take an ecosystem approach to entrepreneurship support. So how I think of that is not engaging just the entrepreneurs themselves, but engaging the broader community as part of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. In a way, everybody is part of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Even an everyday resident is at least going to be a consumer. How are they thinking about business support and what they can do to support local entrepreneurs? But it's certainly local lenders, engaging them, the service providers, the lawyers, the accountants, the chambers of commerce, engaging the high schools. Our high schools have a role in forming young people's expectations about how they might earn a living, choose their career, and how is entrepreneurship being presented in those settings. So I think of some of the best kind of community support for entrepreneurial activity being, again, this ecosystem approach, pretty broad. And I would say too, it can be, it doesn't have to be splashy, it doesn't have to be sexy, it doesn't have to be a really sophisticated incubator. It can be that, but it doesn't have to be. A lot of entrepreneurs, like I said, need the same things everybody else needs. They need childcare, and they need internet, and they need a supportive community. And so I also consider those really valid approaches to supporting entrepreneurship in our communities.
We do have another question, but if there's someone who would like to unmute, please feel free to ask questions as well. So as people are figuring that out, if they want to ask a question, there is a question again. Is there support to help navigate healthcare for new entrepreneurs that don't have access to that through a spouse?
That's a good question. I can't point to a specific service or assistance with finding healthcare, but I could keep an eye out and certainly keep an ear to the ground and see if I could find something.
Something I'm curious about, Tessa, and I know you're not in the forecasting game, but this is data that was for the last 2 years during the pandemic, and now there's an intentional slowdown of the economy, which means that there might not be easy access to capital. And you had mentioned that access to capital seems to be a really important piece for rural and remote entrepreneurs of color, amongst others. Any idea in terms of where that might be going, and as access to capital becomes a little bit more difficult to obtain, any insights on to where this might go in terms of especially that business formation piece that you had talked about?
Sure. So one of the statistics that's I've seen that is really eye-catching to me is that I think it's something between 10 and 15% of startup activity is financed through a bank loan. So that's a significant portion, 10 to 15%, but it's not as though most entrepreneurial activity is being financed through small business loans. It seems to be that, when you survey entrepreneurs, friends, family, and fools are, that's sort of the, I don't know, the shorthand for identifying where entrepreneurs are getting financing. And so this may be a long way of saying that banks haven't been lending that much. When we look at the data, banks haven't really been lending that much since the Great Recession anyway. It's perhaps the case that entrepreneurs are already getting good at finding alternative sources of financing. And one of the things I think is worth considering here is, while I'm certainly aware it's not true across the board, a lot of people have experienced an increase in wealth via the appreciation of their homes, and home equity loans can be a vehicle for financing an entrepreneurial activity. So if it's the case that people are going to maybe use some of these alternative routes for financing, I'm not sure that just because of, we're trying to pump the brakes on the economy, that's going to equate to a slowdown or a stop, maybe a slowdown, but not a stop of this entrepreneurial activity that we've been seeing.
Tessa, I have a curiosity about some of the data, and that was with respect to that Forest County up in the north of Wisconsin had the highest percentage gain increase percentage, obviously, and I don't know about sheer numbers, but increase in business applications. Now, knowing the unique situation there a little bit, I will say there are 2 tribes in that county, and they were one tribe, the Potawatomi, is the largest employer within Forest County, and they were beginning to lay off significantly when not initially, but after the just soon after the March of 2020, when the COVID lockdown started or whatever. So that's some of the explanation right now, which means the casino closings, but not just that, but there are many in both cases. That would be it. So that's probably a significant part of that. But there are other things here that I'm not seeing off the top of my head.
I thought to myself, Chris is going to ask me, and I want to ask him. So you've already spoke to, some of the potential issues to consider. I've wondered about differences in age demographic even. Is it the case that we have an area with more sort of new or new or nearly retired individuals. This has been a sort of growing area of entrepreneurial activity, that people are ready to step away from their wage and salary jobs, or whatever has been their main career, you might call it, over their life, but they're not ready to, they would still like to be productive in some capacity. And so in some of our counties in northern Wisconsin, we're seeing like that type of demographic show up in terms of helping us explain the rise in entrepreneurial activity.
Yeah, and I do think as you know, Vilas County, big to the latter of what you just mentioned. In Forest County, we did, I think, have some of those individuals who might be normally second homeowners who decided that, hey, that's it with COVID, I'm going to leave the city and retire. So you have some of that phenomenon going on too. So yeah, so okay. Yeah, as we continue to try to figure that out. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
And that, again, Michael from Minnesota, I believe they had a journal article or a whole series, a whole journal from the Community Development Institute that dealt with some of that. And I think it was talking in southern Minnesota, in particular in Minnesota, but the silver tsunami. So there is some research out there in terms of people moving in and having entrepreneurial or capital to be able to start those up. There is a question from Gina. Gina asks, do you know of a survey that illustrates the skills or training needs of sole proprietors online and solopreneurs, brick and mortar entrepreneurs?
I can't name one specifically, but I would be curious if one of the Federal Reserve banks, they've done some great surveys of small businesses in general, but also in recent years specifically, as well as the Small Business Administration. That's something that I could look at, but that'll be where I start if you're also looking, the Federal Reserve banks and then the Small Business Administration.
So we do have 3 minutes if anybody would like to ask another question. So I'll sort of pause. We don't have any other in the chat, but.
I don't know if I have a question, but I'm sorry for the dog barking. Kate McCrimmon, I live in Madison, and I support childcare providers who are actually mostly sole proprietors. They generally work by themselves. Sometimes they hire assistants and kind of exist in a very invisible sphere. And it's interesting because as you're talking, and I think I read some of your previous articles about childcare being the answer to get people into the workforce, which I would agree with, but they're kind of in this sort of in between where they are entrepreneurs themselves and survive solely on the tuition of the parents and families they have, but they also need a lot of services in order to survive as entrepreneurs. Like we were talking about broadband and lots of other kinds of things, like just knowledge of technology. And one of the huge needs that I see when I'm working with childcare providers. But I guess, like for me, I just completed my PhD and doing a comparison with 2 different childcare systems. And I am super curious, and I can take this talk to you offline some other time, but as to the difference of like state supported childcare and how that would support the economy versus completely private market childcare. But anything else you had to say about childcare would be just really interesting for me to hear, and just kind of your thoughts about how to get childcare to people, to get them into the workforce. And just lastly, I have read data. Ready Nation has a report that says we lose, I think, $1 billion every year because we don't have childcare for infants and toddlers in Wisconsin. But I'll let you comment on all of that gigantic bit. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Kate, for your comments. So first of all, I am happy to share my thoughts, but there are people more knowledgeable than me to comment on childcare. We had a wonderful presenter just a few weeks ago, Dr. Pilars. Her content is posted on our website, so I would encourage you to check that out. In terms of what I think, a couple routes that we've been talking about in terms of expanding childcare. Certainly, there's an argument to be made that there's a market failure here. And when we see a market failure, the kind of classic economic answer to that is some sort of, oftentimes is some sort of government intervention. So that, the market is under providing a particular good or service. And so the government would step in and provide that good or service. So that's kind of the rationale behind, education to some extent. So there's that. But that aside, if there's no political will for that conversation, there are other routes forward. So one of the paths that I have been trying to understand better is enrollment in dependent care savings accounts. So this is something that private employers could make sure is a benefit that's available to the employees. That are they offering benefits? Is this benefit included? And then do they have any sort of benefits counseling that would encourage families to sign up for a dependent care savings account? Just because this is something that makes it more affordable to families. So kind of chipping away at the edges. Wisconsin is sort of a model, I think, in a lot of ways for a shared service alliance or a shared service model. So we have seen that WICA is involved in that. We have a great example in a shared services model.
Yeah, that's where I'm employed actually.
Oh, great, great. Yeah,
it's part of the shared services. Yeah.
So it well. I see we're getting over time. This might be something we want to take offline, but I certainly appreciate your interest, and I'd be happy to chat some more.
Awesome. Yes. And you probably got the feeling that I like to try to end as close to promised as can be. So just one last note, Sam Rickers from WEDC did drop in the Start in Wisconsin. So if you are looking for resources, that's a wonderful resource. If you're not familiar with it, we will include it in the materials afterwards, but you can find it in the chat below. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much, Tessa. As always, wonderful information and a wonderful presentation. And thank you everyone for sticking around and joining us today. And we hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everybody.